Good afternoon. We'll call this special meeting of the Charlotte City Council to order. Today we will be having, I believe, our first discussion around infrastructure. So staff and council have been working very hard over the past few weeks to pull this together. I'll speak for myself, but I think I do speak on behalf of the group that's been working on this. We really do believe that this is the first step, the first meeting, the first discussion in a series of structured discussions that get to the root of council's desires and the community's need to understand how we deal with infrastructure, what our needs are, and to bring forward our priorities and ideas about how we continue to deal with growth in our city. This meeting is really intended to be as much council conversation and discussion as possible. So we have structured this to limit the amount of time staff is presenting to maximize time council wants to use. So we do have another meeting this afternoon. Our monthly rezoning meeting is to start at 4 o'clock. So we have as much time between now and then. We will have another meal for council at dinner. That should be ready about 3:30. So we probably want to keep that in mind. But again, the full time is here for the council to use as we so desire. Really, it's structured where staff will only be giving about 25 minutes of presentation between the two sections. And the rest of that time, again, will be a facilitated conversation with council. I've been working on this along with Council Members Bakari and Council Member Johnson to get us to today. So I would like to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves, introduce today, and whatever else they would like to share with the group. So I'll start by recognizing Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I am Renee Johnson, District 4 Representative, and I am honored and thrilled to have this conversation today. I want our voters and our residents to know that we hear you. We hear your concerns regarding the influx of growth in the city and the imbalance of the infrastructure. So I'm looking forward today. This is one of many meetings, the first of many, to look at the areas where we might need to prioritize infrastructure and honestly take a step back and look at areas that have been impacted and we may need to address the lack of infrastructure in different areas. So again, I'm thrilled to be here. It's an honor to have this discussion, and I look forward to the outcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bakari?
Thank you. I mean, this meeting's been a long time in the making, and we've talked about it for years, right? Which is, we know that infrastructure investment is both a hazy word that everybody thinks of 100 different things when they bring it up. And it's also an area where, there's a lot of need that hasn't even been calculated. We don't even know what it all is. We just know we anecdotally hear about it a lot on rezoning nights once a month when most of the time neighbors come in and say, I don't want you to build this here because of congestion or lack of sidewalks or lack of sewer infrastructure or water infrastructure. And it's all kinds of different things. And I think this is a great first step in the right direction where staff will come forth and lay out to us, okay, this is kind of what we think a master list looks like of what infrastructure means across the board. And that could include everything from what you normally think of, which is like roads or sidewalks, to the things that are under the roads that we don't give a ton of airtime, like water and sewer piping, to the things like police services, fire services, and then the softer areas as well. So having a holistic list and understanding it is a big first step. And then the big second step is, what are we going to do differently than we do today? So we already do all these things, right? This is what staff exists for. They're going to keep doing them all in that form or fashion. So it's not a question of like, okay, are we going to do this or that? The question is, here's what we do. And then the second question is, what would we prioritize in the first phase of this work effort that we would try to really analyze and take to the next level? And I think that's what hopefully the crux of the conversation we'll have today, because I think what we'll find is, being honest, in the last 5 years, the only piece of infrastructure that we've really gone down and looked at the scoping and size, in the beginning, we did a little bit with stormwater, and we've done a ton with affordable housing. And we understand there's 25, 27, 32,000 units of affordable housing crisis. We understood in the early days there was $1 billion stormwater backlog. We don't really know what the holistic impact of our infrastructure needed investments look like. So to be able to have all of this stuff in a tool that enables us to make budgetary decisions, to say we need bonds for this or that, to do all that kind of work, this is the foundation for that. So I think that this will be a successful session if we agree upon, yeah, this is a holistic list of what the definition of infrastructure means. And two, we give staff guidance based on what they give us of their plan of what they're going to go do next to take a subset of that to the next level.
Thank you very much. And again, this is going to be a discussion really for council to use the time in the way that we want it. But we know we need help to make that happen, to get us to the next stages of how we continue this conversation during our council retreat, during our Housing and Jobs Summit, how we get to our budget process, and whatever other part 2, 3, or 4 of this conversation council needs to have. We have a facilitator that is going to help us figure that out with our conversation today. So I'd like to give a few minutes to Ms. Kami Andrea to introduce some of the ground rules, as well as her general introduction and how we're going to go about today once we get to our discussion. Ms. Andrea.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Can you all hear me? Hello. So I am a little closer. How about that? That's awesome. Excellent. So yeah, as you said, I am Kami Andrea, as Mayor Pro Tem said, and I am excited. Mr. Bakari, I think you made a very good point in what you said, in that we need to come together. You need to come together in understanding infrastructure, right? Starting with a clear point. And so to help you all engage and to move this conversation along in as a productive way as possible, there are some ground rules. You each have a copy of those. They're pretty straightforward. I don't think that you would have any question. I just want you to remind you, we talked a little bit about this earlier amongst some smaller conversations, that words matter, right? So each of you council members represent individuals who they want you to bring their ideas and what's important to them to the table. And so we want to make a way for you to do that, but do it in a way that allows us to continue to move forward. Any questions about the ground rules? Awesome. So rolling with number 4, silence means consent. I think we can move forward. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you very much. And just one note before I pass it over to staff, to get to section 2 of our agenda, Ms. Andrea did put some index cards down. So while staff is presenting, if you guys have questions or comments, not just for yourselves, but can maybe help Ms. Andrea think about convening all of those ideas into the conversation, that would be very helpful. So let's utilize all our tools. And with no further ado, I will pass it to staff, Ms. Babson and Ms. Craig, and they have told them already, they will be on a timer. So they will have 15 minutes to introduce the Section 2 where we will define our infrastructure.
So with that, I'll talk really quickly. Again, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion with you today, Council. We know this is something that's been important to you. We've heard you. And we know we're here today because this is something that you requested more information on. We know you make important decisions every week related to growth in the city through the rezoning decisions, economic development projects, capital investments, and we want to be able to provide you with some meaningful information about how we measure impacts from growth and where we have opportunities to do a better job of measuring that, so that you have the information that you need to make those important decisions as you consider whether or not we have the infrastructure capacity in the future. So again, this is the start of a discussion to determine how we evaluate and measure the impact of growth in the city and how those growth impacts our infrastructure. As we go through the discussion today, you'll see that we're in very different places on a number of these priorities and our ability to measure those impacts. We believe this is likely a 12 to 18-month process that we will be going through with you as we develop and implement work plans necessary to develop that comprehensive set of information. So again, just a quick overview of the agenda today. You were provided over 100 pages in a pre-read of information which highlighted several of the priority infrastructure areas, as well as a list, which is an inventory of over 100 infrastructure items. We'll go through how that list was developed and focus on the 9 priority infrastructure items recommended from staff. And then that's an opportunity to have a council discussion and hear from you, and we're seeking your feedback at that point so that we can determine if we've got that priority, if we've got those priorities right. Then we'll move into a discussion of those 9 and share with you more detail on what we're measuring and developing in the way of work plans to measure those priorities further. And then we'll have council discussion at that point as well. With that, Allison, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Liz. So as Liz mentioned, there is a full list in your pre-reads of all of the different areas of infrastructure that we identified, and this was done in conjunction with many of the city departments here, City of Charlotte. And we organized these into different categories just to help us organize our thoughts. And so the different categories were community needs, green infrastructure, utility infrastructure, operations, transportation, telecommunications, and emergency services. And so as Liz said, you'll have an opportunity both to weigh in on this master list to see if there's anything that we left out, as well as the 9 priority items that we identified. So again, these are about 100 different areas that we identified as all different kinds of infrastructure that include both hard infrastructure as well as social infrastructure. Thank you. So when we were working towards looking at both this master list as well as looking at the 9 priority areas, we really went first to some adopted plans that the city has adopted in the last few years that relate to safety, land use, and mobility. They include the Comprehensive Plan, Strategic Energy Action Plan, Vision Zero, SMP, among others. A lot of work has been done in these areas with the community and with council, and felt that this was an important place to start. And it's also an area, there are areas where we believe we have some level of control and influence as it relates to these areas. Next slide. So, as I mentioned before, there are many different kinds of infrastructure, and all of these plans talk about infrastructure in different ways and how they shape our communities and ensure access to community needs. So complete communities have a number of different elements that make them successful, that form these different types of infrastructure, whether they're soft infrastructure or hard infrastructure, and includes parks, open space, different utilities, emergency services, and goods and services, among others. And I think it's important to note that while these are all elements that are very much important to the success and of a thriving community, that not all communities look the same, and not all communities need the same things, or may lack different things. So I wanted to mention an important next step in the planning process that relates to the conversation that we're having today, as well as the understanding that communities have different needs. So the next step in looking at the comprehensive plan and other citywide guidance that we have is community area planning. And so right now we have different ways in which we plan for infrastructure that includes CIP, the budget process, and more. And we've done area plans in the past, but this is an opportunity to do things a little bit differently and to do area plans that span the entire city. And so beginning early next year, January, February, we'll launch a 2-year process that will do area plans separated into 15 different geographies that span the entire city. And in addition to making some refinements potentially to place types from the adopted policy map, we'll also have an opportunity to discuss at the community level different infrastructure needs and phasing and ways in which these can come to fruition as part of this process. So I wanted to mention that because it's an important step in the conversation, that while we still will have ongoing conversations about how we identify and prioritize infrastructure, this is another tool and an opportunity that we are doing differently going forward. So Marie, I believe, will be sending you out some links, but I wanted to talk about another tool that's important and new that, that you may not be aware of. So in July of this past year, we launched the implementation dashboard. This is a way in which we are working to measure our success in realizing the goals of the comprehensive plan. And so if you were to look in the comprehensive plan, there are 10 different goals, and in each of those goals, we have a number of metrics in which we evaluate ourselves. And so the implementation dashboard is an early start to starting to measure this. Of course, it's only been out for a few months. We don't have all the data available to us. Some things are things that we don't even measure today or that we want to measure. There may be some things that come out of these conversations that will influence what we want to track going forward. And there are also some areas where we may be measuring them, but we're not measuring them in a spatial way. And so this dashboard right now, when you go to it, you can look at the bottom and there's the 10 different goals, and you can start to look at how we're doing overall as a city. But I think what's really impactful too is that we can start to look at the success on a neighborhood profile area. So I wanted to make sure that you're aware of those. You should have also received another link. This is another tool that that you'll be able to sort of play with some of the layers that are on this GIS tool. And I appreciate Andrew Bowen and Evan Lowry and their team for preparing this. It was really prepared just for today, kind of relates to some of the pre-reads that you all received. And so there's a couple things to note on here, and I know it's a little hard to read, but if you're zooming into the tool on your iPads, you can see that there are sort of gold-colored dots, and those are all the approved rezonings in the last 5 years. These are really helpful, but there are some city services and other providers that don't really look at rezonings as a measure of providing infrastructure, because rezoning doesn't always mean that something is happening, it's getting constructed, it may be late, or it may not happen at all. And so the purple dots on here are certificates of occupancy. So those are true and real projects and units that have been constructed and put in the ground. So you can see on here that there is a heat map, and the heat map relates to response time for our fire services in areas that are in red, are areas in which we're not meeting the response times that we need. But you can see too that there's also some dots on there showing future fire stations. Right there in the middle of Hidden Valley is one that's coming in 2024. And you can see that there may not be a lot of rezonings in that area, but there have been a lot of COs issued there, indicating a need for more services. And so this is just an example of how we can use visual data to really start to talk about how the pieces fit together and how we plan in the future for growth. So as we mentioned in the beginning, we started with this 100+ items, and we sat down with all the different departments in a room talking about different priorities and what were in our adopted plans, what we had in other priorities that the different city departments have, what we've heard from the community, And we narrowed the list down to 9. And again, when we pause for feedback, this will certainly be an area where we're very interested to hear what council feedback is. Next slide. So these are the 9 items that we came up with, and these are not listed in a order of priority. They're just, it's a list. And the 9 that we came up with relate to affordable housing, which I think a couple of you have mentioned already this evening, or this afternoon, emergency services, public open space, and that's in the form of parks as well as public open space and development projects, public storm drainage, infrastructure, public transportation, different types of public transportation, roads, sidewalks, schools, safety, transportation safety is one that we hear a lot about, as well as water and sewer capacity. And so you can see up here that that we've identified the primary responsibility of these different areas of priority that we're recommending, that they're not all provided by the city. And I want to note too that it's not even just our partners at the county and the state and CMS, it's also the private sector that plays a big part in bringing these forward. And one of the pre-reads that you all have is a list of the infrastructure that's provided by the private sector through development, as well as an indication as to what's new from the UDO, which there's a great deal of. And so the private sector is an important part of bringing this infrastructure to our community. But it also requires collaboration with these other partners, which is the suggestion for the 12 to 18 months where we can really sit down with the county, with CMS, and with the state to talk about, once we come up with a priority list, how that we can work together to realize these. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you very much, and you did it with 3:30 to spare, so I think we're starting on a good foot. Well, now, you know, this is the time that is up to us. We have a couple of questions we would like council to consider as we can consider this section on the definitions of infrastructure and how we prioritize this. Do the priority areas reflect council's priorities? We're looking at that list of 9 that was on slide 11. Are there any priorities that need to be added? As we look at, you know, if you have your binders from your pre-reads, that exhaustive list was presented from page 1 to page 4. Now was the time to kind of dive into some of those. As Ms. Craig said, staff provided us a list, and pretty much it looks like somewhat alphabetical order, not a sequenced on, you know, what is their top 9, 1 through 9. So if there is a desire to prioritize, I think maybe that's part of it too. Mr. Bakari?
Yeah, just follow-up question. If you go back to that list, I think what will help us in our conversation is just 2 questions for staff. One, what's the logic behind you guys choosing this list? And 2, I know the body of work is to create the plan, but what's the skeleton of like what would happen over and above what we're already doing in these topics over the next 12 to 18 months?
So let me answer the second part of your question. That's actually the second part of this discussion today, where we will drill down in more detail on those 9 and talk about outcomes and metrics. And then the first part is, you know, I'll give you the short answer. Allison, you can add anything if I miss it. So if you look at this chart and the way the information is laid out, to some extent, those 9 minus schools are really the areas in which we provide city services, and we have the opportunity to really influence the way in which that infrastructure is provided in the community.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. So this is a clarifying question. With going through the pre-read, I'm just trying to tie in out of the exhaustive list of infrastructure in the pre-read, these now tie into these 9 priority areas that have been identified, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
So when I'm looking on here on page 3, and we have the category right under transportation infrastructure, we go to utility. When you turn over to page 4, utility continued, and in there, we have landfills, capacity, and who the lead entity is being the county. It will also be helpful how we have this breakdown that was on the previous slide to figure out how our relationships work with these entities, whether it's county, state, private sector. Do we have any authority in some of these? Do we have limited authority? What that relationship looks like when we're looking at the priorities? Because if it's an area where we have limited authority in it, then I think that's something that we might want to consider moving out of our priority infrastructure and putting in a different bucket of community priority infrastructure. And then that's something through intergovernmental relations, where we can talk about building the relationships. But for us, for me, it'll be more helpful to know which of these do we actually have authority on. And if it is in relationship with county, state, private sector, giving us an idea of what mechanisms do we have in place to help influence those discussions.
So what I hear is a sort of a process map. What are the processes where we interact with the county on landfills or CMS on school development?
Correct. And in that process map, again, first listing, do we even have authority? Because if we don't have authority, is that beneficial to have it as a part of our priority infrastructure? Thank you.
Ms. Andrea, did you have something? You good?
Thank you. Is that a question, Councilmember Luana? Her question, can that be answered now?
Yes, ma'am. So Councilmember Mayfield, in that list, that exhaustive list of the 100-plus items on infrastructure, in that final column, we do have lead entity. And so that represents the places where the city has a role in some part of that infrastructure. We could, if you're asking us to, go into another level of detail similar to what you see on the slide ahead, if that's what you're asking.
I don't think that's really getting to the question that I asked. I see that the lead entity specifically for this, landfills, is the county. But where the city has a role is our language and what areas of the city we've identified for something to happen by right. As we're going through looking at development throughout, there may be an opportunity because of the 2040 plan and the research that was done with it, that we might need to rethink some of the current language that we have based on the needs of the community today. So even though we have the lead entity, I think it would still be helpful, and I don't know if that would be adding an additional column or just adding an additional page to really say how much authority. So we have, specifically looking at landfills, we have lead entity county, but it's the city of Charlotte's language that was done through planning that's identifying where landfills can go. That's something that we should be working on and potentially could be, since the 2040 plan is a living item, to be able to look at, okay, how close to residential are we looking at this? And based on the needs, how effective and responsive are we going to be to the community?
Yes,
Thank you.
ma'am. Thank you for that clarification, and we would require more time to follow up with that information.
Ms. Andrea?
Thank you. Liz, I think you just answered. I was going to ask if you had enough clarification to be able to give that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Ajmera?
Thank you. So under priority infrastructure areas, this is really good because this sort of summarizes all the infrastructure needs that we have, and there are 100 plus. In this, I think one that I would like to see added is the green infrastructure, especially our tree canopy. And I know that's under city's responsibility with our 2050 by 50 goal. So I'd like to see that added. I see open spaces here, public open space, so maybe combining it with green infrastructure and also our electrical grid, as we are working on our 2030 goal for CAP and 2050 community-wide goal, I think would be very helpful because a lot of the green infrastructure is provided by the city, especially our electric charging stations throughout the city, especially in corridors of opportunities. So Ms. Babson, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, we can take that feedback. Allison, I don't know if you have anything more specific to add to that, but this is absolutely the kind of discussion we were interested in having with council.
I mean, we certainly thought about tree canopy as a part of open space.
Open space, right.
I mean, that is an important part of open space is having tree canopy, but, so I'm not sure if you're wanting that as a separate item or just how trees are a part of our open space.
Or just having green infrastructure, because that includes everything. That includes trees, open space, the Cross Charlotte Trail that city has invested so much money in, electrical grid. I mean, even city plays a part in air quality, so all of that. So I think having green infrastructure would include open space.
Yeah, that was one of the comments that came up in a discussion. There was a comment from the community that, for instance, parks is infrastructure. And we don't have that kind of portioned out, but, you know, it does fit under that public open space
Right.
portion of it. So, you know, I think an important part of this is, as it was stated earlier, language matters. If we feel like that topic isn't being specifically said out loud, it's not being taken care of, but I think we need to come to some type of understanding of what is in the umbrella of all of these priority lists, and that is where some of that frustration, I think, lies. Ms. Andrea? you have-
Yes, I would agree, Mayor Pro Tem, with regards to the public open space. So I don't know, maybe in the process, is it, can I ask that you guys go through each of those 9 priorities and tell us what is included but not listed? Is that fair?
I think Ms. Babson, under green infrastructure you have under the list, I think that's pretty comprehensive. So if you were to just add that instead of open space, that includes everything on slide 4 that I'm referring to, so that it's comprehensive.
Mr. Grant?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Just looking, if you go back to the list again, the 9, and was just wondering whether or not there was any conversation in reference to broadband as a infrastructure, especially as the city grows. We're talking 10, 15 years from now. That's a basic utility, I think. And so I was just wondering, was there any conversation around that?
So, you know, I talked about some of the work that Mr. Bakari and I have been doing as we've been working on broadband kind of policy. And the work we've been doing as a city, we think, you know, that is one of the types of infrastructure that hits on a lot of these priority areas, right? It's under the umbrella of affordable housing, right? From equitable community standpoint, right? It's certainly under the emergency services priority list, right? This is something that, again, council, we don't really talk about in depth, but police, fire, they rely on their communications networks, and that relates to, you know, the infrastructure that is in the ground and in the skies and on towers. And stuff that is emerging. Thinking about how we utilize public open spaces, you know, during the pandemic, for instance, we did a lot of work about creating these public hotspots, basically, around public infrastructure, so folks could have that connectivity. Certainly a topic of conversation around public transportation. And schools and of course, transportation safety, right? These are things that, as we're looking at the future of mobility and the safety of complete streets and roadways, the ability to have connected streets is not just a physical connection. There's a digital connection that is happening. Again, these are things that we might not think about or talk about. So I know, again, from the work that I've been doing with staff and other council members on this is something that we, and the private sector, of course, is on the forefront of the way we're thinking about it. But again, it's something that sometimes gets missing in some of these conversations. Staff, I don't know if you have a response to that.
Yes, great point. And so I will say it is on the list of 100.
Okay.
But it did not make it to the priority list simply because we're not the primary supplier of that infrastructure, but because much of that infrastructure is dependent on having access in the right-of-way. That's how we're able to manage the way in which that service is provided in the city.
Okay.
I would also mention to that point, I know I've gotten many of inquiries. I'm sure many of you have. But the first mention of this infrastructure meeting, the private sector was very engaged and inquisitive about how we're approaching these things. And I would also note that for those that are watching online or on television, that we have some of our partners in the private sector as well as our staff in the room right now. So perhaps that's an area, an opportunity for future meetings where we're able to have a conversation with our partners, both in intergovernmental and the private community. But again, understanding that it was important for council that we have this conversation amongst ourselves and our staff first and foremost. Ms. Johnson?
Thank you. I guess I just needed a little more clarification to piggyback off what Councilmember Ashmira said. It looks to me like the headers for the priority areas are different than the categories in our pre-read. So I think it would help if the categories were consistent, like public open space. That's not defined there, but it is defined clearly if we look at green infrastructure. So I would propose that the priority language matters and that the language be the same. So, because all of these areas, you know, are priorities for us. I've asked several times about wildlife displacement, you know? So that's on here. So if we are considering these issues, and that's the purpose of the meeting, to consider the impact that all of this growth has had on our city and on our infrastructure. So I would like to see that the categories be the same. And if you can go back to that slide, please. And when we ask about broadband, the response was that we're not responsible for, or it's not in our purview. I mean, the same could be said for schools, but it's on there. So I guess I just need clarification on, and also the outcome of the meeting. Is staff prepared to change the priorities based on council conversation? Are we going to see at the end of the meeting, kind of like what we do in the budget meeting and the straw votes, if this list changes based on this conversation?
Ms. Andrea?
Yes, Councilmember Johnson, I heard you ask 3 different questions.
They're used to me.
Awesome. If we could go back and give staff an opportunity to address the first question, and then the second, and then the third.
And before staff, I just wanted to, you mentioned the wildlife thing, right? I think what Ms. Mayfield's suggestion around process maps could be very helpful, right? Because my understanding is that that's an environmental services concern, right? And that's something that's kind of housed in the county. But I know on every rezoning, for instance, they have to sign off on what is appropriate. And that before it even gets to us, they might have resolved issues that with the petitioner or with the developer, however we want to term it. And this is a vision, again, that we never see, right? And then staff isn't necessarily presented. So we as council members don't even know how to directly approach that particular issue. Again, like I said, using that wildlife matter as a, and perhaps staff doesn't have
But-
direct knowledge of it.
But if I can just elaborate on that issue or that item specifically, I don't know that, because I've asked you that question before, Allison. So, excuse me, but I don't know that anyone is actually taking ownership over that issue. So, I mean, that's a question. Question number 4.
So we have talked about wildlife some as it relates to the UDO and the county, and so I think that comes from different places, and so it's a function of land use, it's a function of parks, and so I think that would be an area, if it were added to the list, would be something that we would have to work with our partners on addressing.
Green infrastructure, that category, wildlife is under there. If we just call it green infrastructure versus public open space, I think that addresses it, unless you can define what public open space means on this list for us.
So I may need some help from Liz on this, but the public open space, when we defined it here, was really as it relates to the public open space that's provided in parks. The public open space is provided through development projects, through some of our initiatives like greenways and urban arboretum trails, and tree canopy is a component of that, but it wasn't the driver of that particular category. So that's really that's how we got to public open space and using that particular, those words as the priority that's here on this list.
Ms. Babson?
And just to add to that, Councilmember Johnson, so if you're looking at the list of 100, the categories aren't the things that we brought forward as priority infrastructure areas, it's the assets. So all of those 9 fall somewhere within the asset column on that chart, on that list.
Yes, yes.
Ms. Mayfield?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Actually, following up on Councilmember Johnson's identification, what she says makes perfect sense. We have 7 items, 7 categories that's identified. If we did not have both of these in front of us, looking at this priority infrastructure list, I think we have a better opportunity of renaming. The only thing that will make me even consider that this priority infrastructure list goes along with this is the fact that we kept emergency services. So by renaming it, I think that will also make it clearer for the community when they have access to look at the breakdown of these 100, because then we can go in and clearly see, okay, under operations, this is what we're talking about. Under green infrastructure, just as Councilmember Ashmira mentioned, wildlife is in here, wetlands is in here, trails and other things are in here. So opposed to this priority infrastructure areas being titled the way it is, if we actually align the language with what we have in this pre-read, I think that would be a lot easier, not only for us to follow, but for the community to follow. Because if we say community need, I think that is going to reflect a lot more to our residents and then be able to break down those needs versus how we currently have it, because it's there's a lot of wiggle room in interpretation with what's in front of us right now. Whereas there was a lot more clarity in the breakdown of green infrastructure, what is operations, transportation and infrastructure, utility. Utilizing that same language just helps to create continuity. So thank you for bringing that to the table. Power, if we have consistency in those words, I think it would help to move the conversation forward. So whether it's this council or another council, they will be able to look at it and know what was being discussed previously.
So just for my clarification, what we're saying is that we think the terms that are on slide 11 that are under the column of priority area are insufficient, and that we think the terms that are in the pre-read under the category area, those 8 terms, are more all-encompassing, and that it provides a more kind of effective standard for how we talk about.
For my understanding, correct, and if I'm understanding Councilmember Johnson, that continuity and consistency would actually further us a lot. It will move us a lot further down the line.
Ms. Craig?
So just to clarify, and this is also Liz, the way I'm hearing that is that when we are listing these priorities, that it needs to be, this is the category, and these are the specific assets that are included in this particular list, right? Is that, okay.
Yes. And so if I can, ask you to go back to slide 10.
Right.
This is an example, oh, thank you, I'm sorry. If I can, go back to slide 10, this is an example of what we're talking about and what was done to go from the list of more than 100 to the 9 that we have in front of you.
So clarification, Mayor Pro Tem, because I think we're not saying the same thing. So coming back to 10 and looking at this list versus what I thought I heard and what I'm recommending is just a clarification of the language and consistency in that language. Because when we look at priority area, replace affordable housing with community need. Keep emergency services. I am saying utilize the language that we have in the book. Public open space is too generic. That you all did a great job of creating what that looks like under green infrastructure. What is operations? Using this category language under priority level area, because these priorities are the categories that you broke down. You just gave us more definition in the category of what's included in it. But if you just use those same titles under priority area, I just think it's a lot easier for not only this council and any future council, it'll be a lot easier for community to go along, because if community goes out and has a conversation about roads and sidewalks or schools, which again is not in our preview to a large extent, versus community need, I think I see that gives an opportunity for a much stronger conversation.
Ms. Edgemere?
Yeah.
Hold on, Ms. Edgemere. Ms. Andrea?
Thank you. A couple of things. Ms. Babson, are you clear on what she's asking?
I believe I have a general understanding of that, yes.
Can you, for me, kind of in your own words, put that back just so that we can make sure that we have clarity before we move forward?
So again, back to the example on slide 10, we would have to go through an exercise of doing this crosswalk mapping of sorts for the list of 100 to get to what those categories would be. They will likely be very similar in language to what's listed as the broader categories.
Can I lend a hand? And Ms. Mayfield, please correct me if I'm wrong. What I'm hearing, Ms. Mayfield, and to an extent Ms. Johnson is saying, is that the language in the categories on page 1 through 4 of our pre-read kind of really do set the stage for a more all-encompassing infrastructure conversation, that we should be referring to our infrastructure in those kinds of ways, because it does, when we say community need, we know that we are referring to affordable housing, which is under our purview, but also talking about its relationship to schools, which isn't under our purview, right? And if we don't use that language in our decision-making and our policy-making, then we're leaving something out. If we're just talking about affordable housing, well, then we're not talking about those things.
Right.
And we really do want to think about maybe in our public speak, the way we're talking about these things to the community, that these are more useful tools, understanding that in our offices on the different floors that we're dealing with, you might be dealing with affordable housing or public transportation in a more kind of defined manner, but we really need to be using more all-encompassing terms when we're dealing with the overall topic from a community perspective. Is that accurate?
I'm going to go ahead and say yes.
So I will offer one of the things that I did hear Councilmember Luana say is, yes, the language should be used if that's its intent. I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's what I think is missing in that clarity.
Let Ms. Edgemira go first. I think she has something on this topic.
I think, in a nutshell, what they're saying, just use the category that's already in the pre-read, right? And that's all. There's no rocket science here. It's just use the category. I think there is consensus among Ms. Mayfield, Ms. Johnson, myself, at least on the green infrastructure. And that way, you don't even have to define it here. It's already defined in our pre-read. So you are just pretty much taking public open space out, for an example, and replacing it with green infrastructure. Same thing with removing affordable housing, replacing it with community need, because it will include everything, including arts and cultural facilities that we are responsible for a part of it, for an example. So I think that will just clarify what each category means, because we already have this material. I mean, you probably spend a lot of time trying to get to this, right? And I get it, you probably try to summarize it for us, but I think when you try to summarize it, there was few things that were left out. So I think if you just go back to using this comprehensive list that you have, will just address everyone's concerns.
Is that problematic at all? Is there anything, concerns that you have with that?
So not concerns, I just want to put out there for the council to consider that, again, the list of the 9 priorities are really, in large part, those things that we as an organization can influence through our work, through our investment, through our regulations. The full list of 100, if you look at that sheet and look down on the far right column as the lead entity, there are a lot of those included in that list that we, the city, don't directly influence, nor are we responsible for.
Right, no, I understand that there is a lot of it that is not within city's purview, but however, there is some that is still within city's purview. For an example, arts facilities that we actually fund, especially capital improvements, right? That's not part of this list. So in trying to summarize it, which I think you all tried and did a pretty good job, I think we left out a little bit. We might have left a few. So, and to Ms. Johnson's point about wildlife, if we include green infrastructure, it will include some of the wildlife and open space, because I know as we have gone through some of the rezonings, especially in far east, far up north University area, or even far Still Creek area, we have seen some concerns from our residents, especially around wildlife habitat and deer population and really creating an ecosystem. So even though it's really within county and the state's purview, I think city plays a part in that through rezoning. So I think having that broad enough will address some of the community's concerns that we've been hearing through our rezoning process.
Ms. Andrea and then Ms. Bakari. Did you have something?
I want to go back to Ms. Johnson. You asked about broadband. That was one of the stacked questions that you had. Was there a response to that?
If I can respond, if we change, when the categories are changed, broadband would be addressed. So, yeah, and if I can, well, since I have the mic, right? I appreciate the ownership of the staff, and I understand what you're saying, but in my opinion, the purpose of today's meeting, our rezonings, our decisions impact all of these. And these are the things that residents are concerned about. So while the city staff is not directly able to make those changes, in my example of schools, we're not either. So there might be, we just want to know that there's a plan, that these items are considered. So if there's something that's not in our purview, then we have a plan or a grid that this is referred to another department or the intergovernmental. But we cannot continue not to talk about these items that are impacted by growth. And so that's why I think that this changing it to this language is consistent, it's all encompassing, and we can at least have a plan. That, we have to. We have to. We can't continue to make decisions in a bubble and know, and expect our residents to be more upwardly mobile if they're in failing schools and the schools are overcrowded and we're continuing to approve development. So it's all interconnected. It's a holistic approach, and that's what we're seeking today.
Thank you. Mr. Bakari?
Yeah, I just think it's going to be a lot easier if we go and hear what the actual plan that staff is going to set forth on to do to visualize these, because, I mean, we could go around and just kind of argue semantics of the titles and the topics, but I think it's going to be a lot more impactful if we see what the vision is to be done, and then under that lens, look back at what is and isn't included there.
So I think I just heard from Ms. Johnson and Mr. Bakari in different words. We would like to know a little bit more about how staff evaluates these infrastructure items, the ones that do fall under our direct purview and the ones that we rely on our partners for as well. And I think that's kind of what the next section of this meeting is. Am I hearing that right, Ms. Andrea?
That's what I hear as well. I think that the next section would probably bring more questions as well. Yeah.
Staff, if you're ready, we can move on to section 3, where we talk about how we do evaluate our infrastructure needs. And for that section, staff does, Mr. McKinney is going to join us, and he has about 10 minutes to go through that part of the section. All right. Ms. Babson?
Just real quickly while Ed gets up there and gets set up, again, this is going into a bit more detail on those 9 priority areas, recognizing we had a lot of discussion about changing words that are used to describe those 9 areas, so we wouldn't have had the opportunity to make those changes. So just bear with us in that regard. But this will give you an example. Ed's going to do one of the 9, just to dive into a bit more detail to show you how we're looking at outcomes and metrics and where we still have more work to do in the way of measuring these impacts from growth and development in the city to provide you, council, with some of the information that you're asking for. So with that, Ed, thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Again, Ed McKinney with the Charlotte Department of Transportation. And remind me, I only have 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Okay. Yeah, so just go to the next slide. And as Liz just described, that what I want to try to do is just, again, give you a glimpse of some of the detail that's behind the 9. We're going to use the roads and sidewalks and safety categories to do that and to demonstrate that. What you see on this slide is sort of a template for sort of a summary that we pulled out of the detailed spreadsheet that you have. And so on this slide, just to give you a sense of the structure, going from the right to the left, you see essentially just documenting the policy foundation for where we're going. And so in this example, obviously we start with a comprehensive plan and that goal around safe and equitable mobility. I'll talk about the detail of this slide and the specifics that are in the strategic mobility plan. This slide particularly around managing congestion. And then as a note, there's a couple things I'll describe on this slide around other plans. This one example has the Strategic Energy Action Plan. So there's parts of what's some of the outcomes here that are tied to those goals. And then you see the other column. So the high-level targets, what are we trying to do? If these are our higher-level goals, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? The metrics then are what are the things that we measure? How do we make sure that what we're doing is achieving those goals? How do we sort of track, year by year or over a period of time what the progress is, and are we getting to those goals? And then the far column is what do we need to do? A lot of what's in that last column are, again, some initial, particularly for transportation, some of the initial thinking that's still a work in progress, right? We've talked last month around the mobility work and a lot of analysis that we're doing around taking our goals and thinking about the priorities of projects and how we identify and prioritize those. As you'll see on this list, there's lots of detail work that we need to do. I think one of the questions that came up from that presentation was, show us more, show us some of the detail. This is a little bit of that, not all of it, but a little bit of that. So this one, talk a little bit about this one particular. So this is focused around, the first and foremost one I think we get every month around transportation, the congestion, the kind of how we're managing growth and congestion. And so what you see on this is both existing things and new things. So at the top, the overall target and outcome is our management of the operation and our network. And so there's specific things we do and have been doing right around improving and adding signals along our system so that we have better access and management of our network. We've talked a little bit about the fiber optic cable infrastructure that we're building so that we have a way to connect all those signals and manage them in a holistic way. In the middle there, this notion of intersection delay and capacity, right? That's one of the very detailed things we look at with rezoning cases. And so, again, what we're doing now is aligning those metrics to our SMP goals, the comprehensive plan goals, and again, as we talked about last month, thinking about how we identify and prioritize investment. Two new ones on here, again, addressing similar topics. I won't go into lots of detail, but just to give you a highlight of where we think we want to go, and we'll be back with you with more discussion about what that looks like. That middle one, corridor travel time. We talked a little bit about the limitation of just looking at project by project, intersection by intersection capacity, right? It's important we do that on rezoning cases so that we can make sure that development is doing what they need to be doing within their site, but we also have to look at this more holistically. And so there's some very interesting data-driven analytical tools that we can start to look at corridor-wide that take into account the congestion, take into account the delay at intersections, but give us a better picture of what's happening across that corridor, allow us to look at it more holistically and think about ways, both technological that we can do to manage that, but also physical. And so every corridor is going to be a little bit different. The performance metrics that we would define would be different, and the infrastructure strategy would be different. And as you can see, we've got lots of work to kind of think through what that looks like. Trip length is another one. So we talked a little bit about this. It's important that we measure and track that because it's really tied to the fundamental premise of the land use plan and the 2040 plan. If we put and arrange land use and growth in a different way, it'll have a very direct impact on how we move, the length of our trips. It's very important because it ties to our strategic energy action plan. If we're making shorter trips, we're having a very specific impact on emissions, but also a very practical impact from a transportation capacity standpoint. If you're using less of our system, if the trips are shorter, we gain capacity out of that. So this notion of land use is tied directly to infrastructure and capacity. And so again, it's important that we kind of track that. Just go to the next two. I won't go into the next two in much more detail. Go back one. These are just things that you are familiar, right? The next one is around, we've talked a lot about this mode shift goal. Obviously you're familiar with the ongoing work that we've done for decades around building our sidewalk network, this building of our bike network, expanding our street connectivity. We've had a subdivision regulations in place, so we expect and we build both those new streets, and we expect developers to do those as well. And then obviously that mode share goal, and again, there's some very specific ways with some important data that we need to collect that will help us track the progress to those goals. And so again, the expectation, sidewalks being the obvious example, we know what that need is. We know what the resource we have available to us to build that. And again, we sort of year by year track and target what we can achieve. It's important to note, you'll see in that work plan, lots of relationships and connections back to the UDO and to the Comprehensive Transportation Review. Again, there's lots of new things in the UDO and some things we've talked with you about in that transportation review that are ensuring that development is giving us some of these things, and more so than what we've been doing in the past. And so it's a big step forward, and we're going to be making sure that we're tracking and measuring that and testing whether that's getting the outcomes that we want to achieve. And then the last one, again, this is safety. Again, lots of work that we've already been doing, the adopted vision we have for Vision Zero, tracking that. Certainly we've got data and have been doing that to identify the high injury network and let that guide us from a data-driven standpoint where we need to be investing to improve safety. The two below that are just good examples, right? Street lighting, and those are things that we're targeting, identifying, again, prioritizing where those are most impactful. And then things like pedestrian connectivity, new pedestrian crossings and infrastructure, again, aligned to safety and tied and prioritized based on the data that's driven, particularly around crashes in our high injury network. So again, I'll stop there. That was just as simply to give you a glimpse of the level of detail we would be going into. This is obviously just one example around transportation and pulled directly from some of the detail you have in your spreadsheet.
Thank you, and you did it with 2 minutes to spare, so I'm proud of you. And before I recognize Mr. Bakari, I just remind council, Mr. McKinney he didn't go through all of the slides that are presented. Staff does have other examples of how they evaluate different infrastructure needs. They'll try to, I think, as we start having this conversation, if it matches any of the slides, they'll try to throw those up on the screen. But even this whole list is, as we talked about before, not an exhaustive list of how all infrastructure needs are evaluated by staff in concert with other partners that are needed to do that evaluation. So with that, I'll recognize Mr. Bakari.
Yeah, I think this is a really good view of where we could go. I think that if you think about what's the next steps in what we're going to do and the ultimate body of work, I think these provide great examples, some things that we already kind of do, some that we have planned to do, some new things, but by the topic areas. So I think if we're going to evolve this to the next step that's going to get tactical in execution, I think it's taking this. I think, we're going to still, as a council, need to debate, okay, what should be included. But I think we're going to need to see that next layer here, which basically says whether it's that first, if you go back to that first set of examples. So like the real-time, where was it? It was there was one that was, so new signal needs, right? Assess new signal needs as one example. Think of that as one micro that's underneath an overall bucket of which there's 7 buckets or whatever it is. So we need to understand the citywide metric of like, here the total number. We need to have a view that says somehow like this, if we were to fund it all to be acceptable today, this is where that would be, right? It would take X millions of dollars to get to that point at a city level. And then we need to be able to map that to a policy statement. And this is where our discussion comes in of, this is the level of acceptability. And I think that's where it gets down into a tool. Like you guys have the layered map that we used like on today in a zoning day to show us, water, certain things like that. We should be able to go into these buckets and see if somebody comes in with a rezoning and they say, we're not invested in properly, we can go in and not just at a city level, but at a corridor level, at a street intersection level, we can look at all these topics and say, you're right, you're behind, or you're above. But I think what you've got to do here is lay out like the end state heat map and report that we're going to look at citywide. It needs to be a tool that can dive down from a city view into a tactical kind of tool use in making decisions on rezonings and things like that. And then it needs to be mapped to our current policies. And it's going to be one of 3 things. We have a policy and we're meeting it. we have a policy and we're not meeting it. And we don't have a policy that addresses this at all. And that's where we're going to have the bulk of our work, which is that policy set at the right level? Should we be okay with this level of congestion or this level of minimum for traffic signals and the technology we use there? And so then we're now at the right level of the council doing our work. And we don't sit here and try to make transactional decisions to say, well, you're right, this rezoning should or shouldn't happen there. It should be based on our policy. And to me, like it seems like a huge amount of work because it is a huge amount of work. But I really believe this is the starting point for you guys to come back to us and say, remember those 7 or 9 items or whatever it is. This is the dashboard we're going to work to create, to populate, to fill in. This is the mapping to your policy, and this is the tool that ultimately is going to allow you to both drill in and see the level of acceptability and the amount of funding that's necessary to make that happen. Like that, to me, that seems like a really cutting edge approach to quantify the most important reason why we exist as a governing body right now.
Ms. Andrea?
Mr. Bakari, I noticed when you were talking, there were several nods in agreement around the room with council members and then some with questions. So Mayor Pro Tem, I just wanted to give a space for that response.
I totally appreciate everyone's agreement with me.
So before I see Ms. Ajmera has her hand up, I know Mr. Mitchell has his hand up as well. Something that you were saying, Mr. Bakari, and thinking about the for instance, the systems operation network capacity thing, and thinking about the conversation that we were just having. Well, to me, this all also kind of intersects, right, with broadband technology or digital inclusion. It may or may not because of the fiber optics, right, and how those, I don't know, how those systems connect. Also, maybe, you know, from a process map standpoint, how do we prioritize these types of networks on city-maintained roads versus state-maintained roads, right? Do we as a city, what is the process map of that? How do we know to say, okay, we want to do this on all our intersections, but the state is prioritizing certain intersections, so that, how does that affect the way we might prioritize where we put our assets, knowing that the state investments are coming this year or they're not coming for another decade? So it just started kind of.
I just add one quick point to that, and I'm sorry I have to go to my son's school and leave in a minute here, but I would start this exercise and throw out the window anything that is a non-starter. Like, let's not say, well, we don't fully own that topic, so let's not put it in. That may be a hindrance, right? But I think we need to prioritize by what's the most important stuff for us to knock out in the first phase. And then we try to go to that point and say, like, because we know schools needs to be on that. We absolutely know it, because that just comes up all the time. But we don't own that, but we have to go down that path and figure it out. I think like technology-based infrastructure probably warrants its own bucket there, because at the end of the day, we may hit headwinds that say we can't do this or that, but I don't think we start by minimizing the list to say, let's not put this on there. If it rises to a level of importance to, like, we need to attack it first, even if we don't own it, the state-owned roads thing, that's going to be a big chunk, but I think first we figure out what we're going to measure and what we're going to try to do, and then we figure out, okay, well, what do we need to bring to the table in order to make them change their priority list to do this or that, right?
Thank you. Mr. Mitchell?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Ed, do you mind, I just a couple of questions and just your feedback, so if you don't mind. And so, Council, the only statement I'm going to start out with, I think it'd be important to us is we approach all this from a holistic standpoint, not just one-off or particular section. So, Alice, help me for 1 second. We're about to move to 14 regional, what we call them?
Community area plans.
So we're about to move to 14 regional community area plans, getting away from the district plan. Ed, to me, the first bit of information for us will be helpful as you take those 14, list, if you can, the sidewalks that are already funded and about to take place, and if we can list them by the 14th and the district. Because I just want to make sure we look at everything we do from a sense of equity. We've got the equity framework in place, and so I make sure we are developing all parts of Charlotte. That's number one, because I think we've already have earmarked certain sidewalks that will be funded. Number two, Ed, what is the policy as it relates to development on sidewalk? 'Cause Council, we done went through this 10 years ago. We told developers, you don't have to do sidewalks. Then I remember old Pat McCory, when he was mayor, he forced developers to put sidewalks at least on one side. So can you share with us what is the policy on sidewalks? Because we all get those calls about sidewalks. So question number one, if I may, just the policy on sidewalks.
Sure, I mean, I could.
Just before Mr. McKinney goes, if, council members, if you go to page 16 and 17 in your pre-reads, and we're going to try to pull that up here on the screen as well. It's relevant to the conversation and the answer. Mr. McKinney, go ahead.
This, 16, okay.
You go ahead, Mr. McKinney.
Sure. And certainly Allison can jump in because they're, obviously, as you described, a big part of this is what our expectations are for development. And again, as you described, those expectations have changed over time for good reasons. And so essentially today, but also in the UDO, sort of augmented certainly in the UDO are the expectations, both the physical length, width, and design of sidewalks. So we certainly expect developers, when they're just building on their side of the road, they've got to build the sidewalks to the standards that are described in our UDO.
Okay.
If we're building new streets, we have the same expectation. In that case, it's sidewalks on both sides based on the type of street and the dimensions we expect. So without getting into details, we fully expect, and both our current rules and a little bit strengthened by our UDO rules, have high, expectations around development to build sidewalks as part of their infrastructure.
Perfect. Thank you, Ed. Mayor Pro Tem, could I follow? And so we can turn to slide, okay, thank you. So DeGray, we can take this and then just break it down, what region and what district. I think this will be very helpful. And if we can go to slide 16, we're talking about complete street lighting. And so let's tackle street lighting. Most of us get calls from neighborhoods requesting more street lighting in their neighborhood. And what we have put in place is the neighborhood matching grant. I feel comfortable in saying either we need to increase funding through our neighborhood matching grant, or we need to increase funding and somehow get that responsibility, because we all know street lighting is deterrent for crime. Street lighting make all our neighborhoods safer. And so I could tell you about 3 or 4 of them have applied for the neighborhood matching grant with the new session starts in March. And so I think, Council, that is a very important, we say safety and equitable mobility. How do we fund a street lighting? Is it strictly developers, or is it on the city? Or can we just put more funding in the neighborhood matching grant program? So just to examine it. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem.
Yeah, that's, council members, page 25 and 26 in the pre-read relates to that, if you want to answer the question.
Yeah, and to maybe briefly clarify what's the maps that I think you're pulling up, we do have a map, right, that describes all the, where the needs are for street lighting, but that's very specific to arterials. The issue you're describing is not mapped.
Right.
And is a separate issue that is you're suggesting something we need to look into in more detail.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you very much. Ms. Ajmera?
So, Mr. McKinney, this is a really good presentation where you've already identified needs and work plan in terms of from the city perspective. So staff has already done tremendous work pulling together all the needs and the next steps. From the council, is there anything you need to help staff prioritize? Because if you look at the list on slide number 14 all the way up to slide number 17, under transportation, under transportation safety and roads and sidewalks. This is a tremendous list. I guess what can we do as a council to help prioritize, especially areas that are high injury networks, where we really need to address the gaps sooner rather than later? So if you could just tell us about the steps that council can take today as part of the infrastructure discussion to really get started on this high injury network. That's number one question I have. Number two, I know that Mr. Bukhari requested sort of coming up with all the needs under each bucket and having some sort of dollar number assigned to it. I hear the ask. However, we also have to keep in mind that some of these needs are addressed by the private sectors, especially some of the missing sidewalks, bike lanes. So putting a number out there, it may not be entirely city's responsibility. It certainly would help to show how big the gap is and how wide inequities are in the system. But keeping in mind that it may not be an accurate picture. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell, for bringing the equity framework that council had recently adopted. Because if you look at the sidewalks map that we have, and I know this was something Ms. Batson had provided last year or the year before, and you can clearly see there is inequity. A lot of the sidewalk gaps, it's really in areas that's been left behind. And what policy decision can we make today, or that we should consider as part of our next steps to address some of these gaps? As you can see clearly, there is a lot of gap on the west side, northeast, around Still Creek area, than the other parts of our city. And we clearly need to address that and look at it from the equity angle and really refer to our equity in governance framework that was adopted earlier this year. So those are my questions. So if you want to address one by one.
Yes, let's address one by one. So the first one had to do with priority, I think. Is that right, Ms. Ajamera? Do you remember her question?
Yeah, I think so. So what I would, a couple things. I'll refer you back and I'll talk a little bit about the discussion we had back in November around mobility. So I want to go back to that and talk about where we're going next. I do want to, before I do that, I want to emphasize safety, our Vision Zero policy, and the priority that council has given us now for a number of years, including funds to support that. So we have been prioritizing that really, and we've got the data. We have the data to help us make good decisions, and the funding. And again, our priority, as elevated in the strategic mobility plan, says that is our top priority. So I do want to emphasize that's something we have been prioritizing and continue to do. What we're doing now, going back to our discussion that we just started back in November around the mobility investment, and so more to come. The question is what can council do? We'll be back to you. We're in this process now of shaping some of that initial work that we shared with you back in November. As we discussed, there's lots of ongoing, more detailed work. What we'd like to be able to do is come back. I think we mentioned, I think we'd be back with you in the first quarter of next year to describe where we are, give you a better sense of the details and what's driving that, to get your direction as to making sure that the way we're suggesting, identifying, and prioritizing projects is consistent with where council wants us to be. Again, we start at the high level, the 2040 plan, our strategic mobility plan, but as you know, as we're talking about today in more detail, how you make very specific decisions to ensure that you're being true to those priorities. We need to have a discussion, right, with council about that to make sure. So I would say more to come. We've got more details you see that we need to do to bring back in front of you to have a more detailed, informed discussion about how we want to prioritize and get your direction.
Maybe. Thank you, Mr. McKinney. So I understand that staff has been prioritizing some of the high injury networks, but I think the challenge is where the need is just too wide. As you can clearly see from the list, that we're not able to keep up. And part of it is a funding issue, because I think Ed will often highlight this, that we build, less than 5 miles of sidewalks every bond cycle, because it takes 6 million per 1 mile to build a sidewalk, roughly. And we are just very slowly chipping away that I don't know if we are truly making a dent. So I think at some point, I know that we are having a discussion on budget planning, but that's just from CIP dollars, which is about $250 or $230 million capacity. That is not going to address this need and work plan that we have. It will be drop in the ocean. But I think at some point, as we are looking at our sales tax increase, 1 cent sales tax increase, we do need to figure out how much of this can be addressed through that, a 1 cent sales tax increase. And can we truly make a dent on some of this infrastructure needs? And can we get council on board, right? Certainly, once we have consensus among the council on the priorities for this sales tax increase and what should be prioritized in that list, we need support from the rally to get that done. But I think that should be our number one priority as we move into 2023. Because without funding, none of this would be possible, especially our sales tax increase. I think we have to recognize that, yeah, we can have a budget discussion, but that's just CIP focus. That's not going to address even 10% of this. So I think that would be helpful. And also, I would like to hear from my colleagues as to where they are in terms of prioritizing our infrastructure needs, especially the list that we have from equity framework. We already adopted that earlier this year. Would you like to see we look at equity lens, especially for an example on sidewalk projects? Because clearly you can see where the needs are right now. So I would really like to see equity being implemented, the framework being implemented in this for sidewalk projects. But I would like to hear from my colleagues as to where they are as we move into our budget discussion and then also our sales tax discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may, Ms. Ajmer, one of the questions, what I heard you ask him originally had to do not just with the specific sidewalks, but more of a general, where does council offer our suggestions about priority?
Right.
Right? Was that answered?
Yes, I think part of it, Mr. McKinney answered that they are prioritizing the list. However, I think they need direction from the council as to the priority that you currently have, should it be revised? And I offered that we look at it from the equity perspective and see if we can prioritize it from that perspective. But I think that's where my colleagues will come in and say, if there is consensus, at least majority of the council feels that we need to prioritize the list from the equity perspective, then that's the direction that Mr. McKinney would need, right? Mr. McKinney?
Yes, for sure, and that this conversation obviously is a big part of helping us influence that. Again, we started to do that. We need to share more details. Again, we just touched upon that back in November, and we are beginning to test and apply how would we measure and make decisions and share with you how we might prioritize projects based on equity, based on where growth is occurring based on where our needs are. You know, the challenge is how do we layer those things together and with the resources that we have, prioritize them in a way that achieves multiple goals and achieves the direction we have from council.
I want to recognize Ms. Johnson oh, sorry.
I'm good, that's all I have.
I was going to recognize Ms. Johnson and Ms. Mayfield. But first, I wondered to the point, I wonder if there still isn't certain blind spots that we have from a council perspective. And I'm just positing that, you know, when we think about infrastructure investments on, honestly, specifically the ideas around thoroughfares with sidewalks and lighting, like you said, these do have effects on the quality of life, but they also do have, the lack thereof also has effects on other infrastructure. I think of our fire service, right? I think of Ms. Molina and I were at Company 23 last week, and, you know, it's a fact of the matter. Most of our fire department runs are for medic calls, you know? And so I wonder if part of the way we determine how certain sidewalks get built and where is affected by response times of our fire department and our ability to lessen that, you know, by prioritizing certain areas. So I don't even know how to necessarily form that question to dive into, but I'm just wondering if we still are having some blind spots. Equity is certainly an important aspect of things. Continuity, the ability to fill a gap, and all of a sudden, instead of having a mile connected, having 5 miles connected, that's a priority. But I'm maybe that there's still something missing. I don't know if that makes sense. Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Mr. McKinney, you gave a presentation several months ago about cumulative traffic impacts, and that being a goal for the city. I wanted to know where we are on that, because that's very important in the infrastructure. Can you give an update on that?
Yeah, absolutely. If you
And then I have more questions.
If you go back to that first slide we had, and this is a good example of new things we're testing in this process, right? Where we're thinking differently from the comprehensive plan and strategic mobility plan, aligning that different thinking with certainly what we know to be the needs and the concerns we have around growth. And so the notion of cumulative traffic is absolutely first in mind for us in terms of how we think about managing and infrastructure identification. This middle column, and then there's lots of detail, or this middle row, there's a lot of detail that we want to come back with you to describe this, but it goes back to this notion of, as we all know, we can't deal with cumulative traffic at a project scale, right? We got to look at the broader area, we got to look at a broader corridor, or in the case of as we go into the community area plan process, looking at the broad geographies. There are some tools that we want to test. We want to come back and share with you what those look like that get into metrics that are not just intersection-based, but corridor-based. We've got data that can tell us, okay, what is the travel delay? What's the time? In this case, we've got these interesting indexes around travel time and how we anticipate travel on corridors, and we've got some great data to begin to test that. More to come, lots of detail. To your question around cumulative traffic, this is an example of some new tools that we want to use and some great data that we know are out there that will help us look at it in a broader scale to get us to where we can identify both technological things we can do on those corridors, but infrastructure things we can do on those corridors to help address and kind of begin to manage the cumulative traffic and the broader impact of development on our network.
Okay, thank you. And then my next question, if you can go back to the map with the thoroughfares without sidewalk projects, please. I'm trying to pull up the map of District 4 of state-owned roads. And I would love to see that as an overlay. I'm just trying to visualize that. And also ETJ areas. So what's happening with state and ETJ areas that the city has no ability, and if you do, tell me, but if the city has no ability to improve. And what happens from a resident's perspective, and also from the council member's perspective, we're making decisions for all of this growth. I have a grid, Mallard Creek area alone, there's 20,000 trips that are pending, and that's on top of King's Grant that we approved last year. And there's all these trips with no ability to improve the road. So this is the challenge that council has, the challenge of our residents, and why I wanted to have this meeting. How do we address that? Do we say this area is above the level of acceptability? I love that term, levels of acceptability. So if we're not able to improve the roads, improve the sidewalks, I don't know where the stormwater is in that area, but those are the kind of areas that, or considerations that we need to take before we are approving growth. So I want to know how we address that. And I don't know if it's an intergovernmental planning commission, you know, that maybe has county, city, and school subject matter experts, but council needs education. We cannot continue to make these decisions in a bubble and then be surprised when our residents are saying, you know, enough, or, and they're right. So help me understand, or help me reconcile the areas without sidewalks we know that are state-owned. What can we as a city do about that while we're the ones making decisions for growth?
Before Mr. McKinney goes, you just mentioned the Planning Commission, and if I'm not mistaken, the city, the county, and the school board appoint folks to the Planning Commission, so it might be a note for us for future discussions. How do we better interact with the Planning Commission and understand the kind of logic that the school board and the county has when they're appointing their members, and how do we use that to interface with each other?
Is it possible to hear from the Planning Commission? We have a representative here. Okay, all right, never mind.
We wanted to keep this conversation between staff and council for now, this first one, but again, realizing that we may need a future conversation with more of our partners, but I just wanted to put that note there specifically for that. Mr. McKinney?
Sure. Let me try to address the question. One thing for sure, I think I'm hearing from you is certainly there's a little bit of additional layers we can add to this to make sure that we're all clear about where our limitations as a city are and where partnerships exist. So certainly the maps and data that you have today don't fully do that, so that feels like a takeaway for us. One thing I want to say about the sidewalks, I'll let Liz correct me if I say this wrong, but everything on this map, all the red, some are state maintained, some are city controlled and maintained, all of which we are able to build sidewalks on. And so what you see on this map is the need. And we are, as we all know, we're incrementally, with the limited resources that we have, we're incrementally building that network. A good example, I think we shared at Town Hall last week with Council Member Molina, was just the recently completed partial sidewalk gap on Harrisburg Road near Pence and Albemarle. So there's, we are prioritizing where we find needs, and we do certainly have the ability for sidewalks to implement that infrastructure. And again, that's what's represented on this map. One other quick thing I'll say about, our limitations or our partnerships that would happen on state-maintained roads in areas like East Charlotte. Obviously, there's state projects, and we could certainly provide better information or, more regular information around where those planned projects are, larger corridor and state investment. But back to the notion of the UDO and our expectation of development. So regardless of whether it's state or city maintained, when development comes in, again, calibrated to the impact of their development, that investment or that impact is reviewed through analysis both by city CDOT staff and state NCDOT staff, and the expectation is, based on the scale and the impact of their development, there's investment that they have to make, both regardless of whether it's city or state maintained. Certainly understand the limitation, right? That's very specific to a project. But I just want to make that point. There are limitations and there's different scales by which we do development. The state maintained issue is really around partnerships, both with the state and with development as it occurs.
Ms. Johnson? Oh. Your microphone.
I understand. You just understand the challenge that we have. And that's where we need help. That's where we need help in addressing our residents' concerns, because there are gaps in the process. There are blind spots. So, but yet we are responsible for reviewing growth in those areas without having that information. So that was the purpose, in my eyes, for today's meeting, the consequence of growth and the state of our infrastructure. So I hope that the outcome that we get is to be able to get a holistic document that complements the 2040 plan. Here's the plan and here's the state of the infrastructure, because our goal should be balanced development instead of reactive, infrastructure. So just thank you for the work that you do. Thank you, and I look forward to more information.
So before Ms. Mayfield goes, Ms. Andrea recognized a question that both Ms. Ashmira and Ms. Bakari asked that didn't get touched on, so I want to give her that chance.
Thank you.
But you bring up, this is a term that we often use, and Ms. Johnson said reactive as it relates to our infrastructure investments. And I wonder if that is accurate, because from the outside in, it often does feel like we are being reactive. But staff maintains that they have certain processes and priorities that they look at over time that is actually very proactive. So when we talk about language, I wonder, how do we kind of get to the crux of that? Are we actually being reactive? Is that the right terminology that we use? Is it that the lead time is just so far in advance that it feels like when work starts to get done that it's being reactive? I think that there's a loss in translation that still remains, and I do agree that with you that I think part of the point of it is to get to that kind of an understanding. But Ms. Andrea, I wanted to recognize you too.
Yeah, there's several things happening. Excuse me, that I want to call out before I go back to you, Ms. Ajmira. So when we look at defining infrastructure, when we look at really the goal of today, the information that Ms. Johnson is requesting, and is that needed in order to be able to move forward? That's my question.
The state of the current infrastructure. I mean, so I think that's a question that we only can answer. I know that's something that I hear from certain a few of us. This is something I personally don't necessarily need, because I think we have the state of the current infrastructure and what staff presents.
Okay.
And I think we have a lot of plans over the years that I've been here that deals with that kind of uses the current state as the baseline. And now we do, what we didn't have was, we didn't have a vision of what we did want to become. We were always talking about what it is, where the gaps were, but never had a vision. And that was the whole point of the comp plan. So, but that's just me.
I mean, for our zoning decisions, maybe, do you, as a district representative, we don't have this information and a comprehensive view, or I don't feel like we do. So, I mean, everyone can answer the questions themselves, but routinely. So, I mean, you can say, what you want, but I think the proof is in the pudding that there's so much lack of infrastructure versus the development. So if you have had this information and we're still making these imbalanced decisions, then that would be on each council representative. But I'll speak for myself that we don't have the holistic information, even the fact that I've been asking for cumulative traffic impact studies for 2 years. So we cannot pretend that we are getting information. Yes, staff does a great job with these plans, and it's nice for this information to be presented, but we don't have a multi-layered view of where the hot spots are in the city for traffic and lack of transportation and all of that. So,
Okay.
thank you.
Yes, and I do want to remind you all to write your questions down or write your comments down if something comes to you and you're not called upon, because we do want to get to those. So you have your index cards. Is it Ms. Dante, Councilmember Dante? You were going to say something?
Thank you. I wanted to just first and foremost thank Mr. McKinney for this foundational work, because in a very finite amount of time, we decided to have this state of infrastructure. And I do believe with the view of the capital transportation programs in conjunction with this rubric that we've set up for the infrastructure priority and how we will assess our outstanding targets, how we're going to measure ourselves, and then develop the need states plan for each one of these priorities, I think will create a great baseline for us to then apply different lenses as it relates to what we want to put first, second, and third, right? So we can look at it through any lens, but before we look at it and prioritize it through a lens, we need to have a foundational base. And I think that this begins to build that out. And I'm positive that when we circle back in the first balance of the new year, that we'll have more information, and then we can decide how we're going to assess and make critical decisions. So this was very insightful and informative for me, and I think you guys did do a great job of beginning to answer the question in a very finite amount of time.
I would just add, what I shared was just a small piece of a lot of work that happened. All the other slides across all the other infrastructure pieces. This is just one example of a lot of work that happened over the last couple of weeks.
I'm sure, I'm aware of all of the work that you had to do to tighten this up and present it in this fashion, so thank you.
Ms. Mayfield, and then we'll come back. I got you guys.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Quickly, Mr. McKinney, just following in the line of questioning and clarification of my colleague, I'm gonna need to stop going after you because we are identifying some of the same things. When you do that overlay, and I'm gonna speak specifically to District B since that's the area I rode all through for 8 years. A lot of this area is also heavy industrial area, a construction area where we have large trucks that are driving, even though we have made some improvements. I think that will be helpful as well, because it looks a little daunting when you just look at all this red and you don't really see where we've made impactful improvements, like the sidewalk widening infrastructure that we created, the plan on West Boulevard and off of Tuckasegee and on parts of Westinghouse. But there's a lot of industrial area along with what my colleague identified as far as state maintained and ETJ. So when you do that overlay, I think it will be helpful to identify that as well, because that is a little different conversation when we look at when people are trying to maneuver with accessibility, whether it's walking or biking in areas that have heavy, not only regular vehicle traffic, but heavy industrial, large trucks, traffic that are driving and the safety component with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Graham?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I just got a comment to make, and I guess I'll age myself, and Mr. Mitchell left, so I can't age him at the same time. But I remember when there was no Ballantyne. And I remember when Harris Boulevard was a 2-lane highway. And I remember when the city put infrastructure in place to incentivize growth in University City. And so I say that to say that I think the city has done a great job in terms of investing in infrastructure and trying to be proactive and investing where the growth is. I am not afraid of our growth. I embrace it. It's one of the reasons why we hadn't raised taxes in 5 years. It's the growth and the development. And certainly growth hurts. And there's some pockets in our city where we feel it. And I live in University City. I built a house there 27 years ago. Represented District 4, represent District 2, know the difficulties of being the chairman of the Senate Transportation Committee and can't get sidewalks on Harris Boulevard, right? I know how difficult that is, right? But it's not that the city and or the council is not engaged and or informed or not getting the necessary information. It's not that the city, the county, and the school board are not working together collectively, maybe sometime effectively, sometime inefficiently, trying to solve these problems. They are. We got a money problem, right? We got a money problem, right? And even with the 1 cent sales tax, you saw me run over there, just trying to get some understanding. We got a money problem. We want the benefits of all these amenities, sidewalks and curbs and gutters, et cetera, but the same citizens who are concerned about the infrastructure are also concerned about don't raise my property taxes. And the same 1 cent that we're trying to invest in transportation, I can bet there's someone else can use that 1 cent for something else. And so I just think that Councilmember Anderson is right. I think foundationally, I think this is good. I think we should have this conversation. I don't think we should panic and think the sky is falling because it isn't. I think the problems that we're experiencing is big city problems. You can be the mayor of Los Angeles and have 40,000 homeless people on the street. It can be worse. I think Councilmember Johnson is correct, however, that we ought to be forward-thinking. We ought to ask questions. We ought to probe. But it all comes back to the budget. And infrastructure for me is the basics. Every time we do approve a rezoning, it's fire, it's police, it's water and sewer, and it's sanitation, right? The basic things. And it's the road infrastructure. Every road in, Councilmember Johnson, 49, 29, Harris Boulevard, right? It's state roads. I mean, I fear myself driving down Harris Boulevard at night and someone is walking wearing black and I can't see them. And I said, where's the sidewalk, right? So I get your frustration.
And then 311 gets the call.
I get it.
No?
So
And then 311 staff is blamed.
So I just hope that language matters, right? That we don't send this message to the community that somehow we aren't doing anything, or that we have failed to deliver. I think we've delivered greatly, but 121 citizens every day move to our community. We hadn't raised taxes in 4 or 5 years. We got problematic relationships and getting increases from Raleigh to do things. And so and I first got on council in 1999, so, I mean, we've been dealing with these same, James, you're older, right? We've been dealing with these same issues, these same conversations for a while, so I just say that to make sure that we kind of put some of these conversations in perspective. I know viewers are watching, and I don't want to leave the impression that somehow we're making decisions in a vacuum, nor, and I only speak for myself, that we're going to slow down growth or we're going to stop growth, because that would be detrimental to our growth. And it was just politically irresponsible. That's what I was looking for. That would be politically irresponsible to do that.
I was 16 in 1999.
Hey, don't rub it in. I was barely out of high school. Oh, see that? You see all this love, Malcolm, for us oldies? Stop.
Just giving perspective. And I think that perspective would help us have and I think, Bakari, sometimes he's right? But I think.
We won't tell him, Malcolm.
Yeah.
He's going to hear that you said that.
Yeah, but I think it really helps guide the conversation if we really have some perspective, and we just don't panic and we don't scare the community. The growth issues are real: housing, roads, sidewalks, water and sewer. I just had a conversation this morning with our ED director about something that's really exciting that's going to impact fire, police, sidewalks, infrastructure. I mean, but we can't say no to that.
But we're not saying anything the residents don't know. So, I mean, we're not scaring the residents. I mean, people are being displaced. So for the same 100 or 88 people that are coming, there are people being displaced in their home. I mean, we had a whole tent city. So we're not saying anything that residents don't know. They know the crime is up, all of that. We're talking about it. And that's why this meeting is important today, to talk about it.
Well, I think we should be careful with that, because certainly people feel the effects. But I don't know how much folks who aren't plugged in to these topics that we deal with really do understand how all these pieces and parts work together, right? I don't think people totally understand, for instance, we have one of the largest utilities in Charlotte Water, and how, dealing with those infrastructures, right? How the city is changing, how we're going to a more vertical city versus a horizontal city, and making sure that there's enough water pressure, that can reach up to 5, 7, 10, 13, 20 stories, and the amount of investment that needs to go into that, and the type of planning, and how that investment can affect affordability over time, and ability to have affordable housing and mixed income neighborhoods. And we haven't even talked about that those parts. People certainly understand the effects, but I don't think that they understand what goes into it, and that's what they are really relying on us to understand, which is why this is an important conversation. With that, Ms. Ajmera, I have you next in line for a comment, question.
I hear Mr. Graham really helping put things into perspective here, especially for many of us who weren't around in 1999. But at the same time, I do recognize the concerns that often get raised by Ms. Johnson, Ms. Watlington, especially the district folks. They are under tremendous pressure every time there is a rezoning request. And I recognize that. I attended Ms. Molina's town hall last week, or was it the week before? And I heard loud and clear that there is no area plan for the Far East, and we need to catch up on that. So I think there needs to be a little bit of balance while addressing the concern, but while also keeping things into perspective And that's where Mr. Bergman comes in, because I see him as a magic man. He hopefully he will address some of this through the budget process as we dive into that at the beginning of the year. But I would really like to just get more granular, because I think there is a gap here, because I hear from Mr. Winston that he feels that the current state of infrastructure, he has that information from the plans and from the list that we have. But I hear, on the other hand, Ms. Johnson says that she doesn't have enough information when the rezoning comes in front of us. So I guess if you could just give us a specific as to what you would like to see in the zoning package that is currently not being included. I know oftentimes you bring up cumulative impact. So does that mean you'd like to see cumulative traffic impact? I guess if you could just give us more specific as to what would enable you to make this zoning decisions a little bit so that you feel like you have enough information every time.
Well, yeah, cumulative traffic impacts is something I've been asking for years. And what that means is, currently, if there's a zoning petition with less than 2,500 trips, there's no traffic study. We know that. You can have one zoning with 2499 and one next to it with 2499 and one next to it with 2499, and there's no traffic study. So it's not just what I want to see. I want to see better policies that assist our residents more. When I talk about what we don't have in our packet, we don't normally have a look back of what's currently pending in the zoning package. There is a map now, but we just need more, we need better policies to address these issues. It's not about what I'd like to see, it's what the residents need. There's a zoning tonight that's industrial. You know, we just need just more information. I can't solve it today, right? But we know there's an issue, we know that there's more information needed, thus today's meeting that we've not had before. So we have to discuss the infrastructure. We need to start looking at our growth in the city holistically. We need to be able to identify hot spots. There might be areas that don't have the sewer water capacity. We didn't even get to that. You know, so we need this information.
So to follow up on that, Ms. Craig, I know you sort of oversee the zoning packages and all the artifacts and attachments that go with the rezoning. Do you feel that you can address some of the requests that Ms. Johnson is making by adding additional information, especially what I hear loud and clear Ms. Johnson is saying is really the cumulative impact that she would like to see? Is that something that can be done?
And I've talked to you about numerous things before, so yeah.
So we're certainly happy to start including things that you're interested in having in those packets. I will say, and I may need lean on Ed to help me out here, but in terms of the traffic impacts and the thresholds and the 2,500, I mean, those are changing as part of the UDO, and so all rezoning projects that are submitted after February 1st have to comply with these new regulations. And so there'll be lower thresholds. There will also be, for by right projects, a comprehensive transportation review that's required as of June 1 that starts to address multimodal improvements. So there are things coming, and it may be helpful for us. We kind of try to give you a preview of that in the pre-read of some of the infrastructure that's going to come through the UDO. So it might be, and it may have been a long laundry list and hard to go through, but that might be something to kind of walk council members through. But back to the rezoning packet, if there are things that you're wanting to add to that, something we can take a look at for sure.
I think Councilmember Bakari, and I've said this differently, as far as if we had a packet where we had multi-layers, but he's a technology person, of course, and, he said, let's do that. There might be an app for that, right? So if we had that, even affordable housing, if we looked at the map, where do we have an influx of it? Where are we missing it? How do we balance things equitably? So, I mean, just a holistic look, if we had a tool where we could look at different hotspots, does this have the stormwater capacity? We just have to be able to start looking at the city's growth and the infrastructure and be able to weigh them and consider them together. When residents are saying, this area is so crowded, and I'll say District 4 again. There's a lot of development right now in that Mallard Creek quadrant that's pending. I have to ask, what's been approved and how many trips? And so I can see that information, but we need to be able to really be able to identify that. Maybe that's not an area where this much growth is appropriate.
So we do have a tool called Charlotte Explorer that has a lot of layers on it, including approved rezonings among many other things. And so maybe that's an area that we can look at to see how we can make sure that tool is accessible and usable for council members. But there is a lot of data out there that staff uses, as well as our external users and developers. And so maybe we can look and see how that might be something that we could utilize for council members as well.
I just heard something you said. I've heard it before, but maybe I'm hearing it in a kind of way and for the first time. What I'm hearing, I think what staff, I want to say, gets frustrated with, but, so much of our development, it's not driven by us, right? It's driven by the private sector. And what I hear is that you need a tool, you need a way to be able to, when you're talking to the people that are coming to you wanting to do things in your district, for a way to kind of pragmatically analyze and give them an honest opinion of what you feel is in the best interest of your community, right? And they're going to do what they have the rights to do, but you're feeling that you need the ability or something that you can say, hey, look, this is what's happening here, and I have these concerns. What are you going to do to address these concerns? Is that accurate?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we can all think about our rezoning petitions, and, we are looking at these rezoning petitions transactionally. So we need to be able to look at our city and know the state is of the sidewalks, of the affordable housing, of the school capacity. I mean, if we could just have a tool where we could look at all of that holistically, we can make, I think, greater decisions, and our residents will feel heard. I mean, and our residents, we can evaluate based on data, if this is a good fit or if this is an appropriate fit for that area. But I mean, I don't have the solutions. I just know I'm happy to discuss it. I know this is the first of many meetings. So I don't know if it's time to do a recap or whatever and start summing things up. But yeah, I think that's what I'd like to see. I just want our residents, we need to ask the questions. We need to step back. This excessive and explosive growth that we've had over the years, this conversation is responsible politics. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to do a quick time check. It's about 3:10. We still have plenty of time to continue our conversation. It feels like I like the way this has gone so far. It feels good to be able to sit around and talk. I think there's some things that we might want to tie up, some things that were put onto the table that haven't gotten touched. But it does sort of feel like we're getting to the place where we need to start defining what are the next steps, right? How do we continue this conversation in an effective manner, and whatever it is, whether it's in our Housing and Jobs Summit, our council retreat, into our budget process, into this infrastructure meeting part 2, 3, or 4, whatever it needs to be. How do we bring our partners into it? I think we should also think about what staff said. I think they do see a pathway to continue to answer the question of how do we evaluate our infrastructure needs and present council with tools to wrestle with that. But they also said that's going to be a 12 to 18-month process. Just putting it out there, there's going to be another council that is going to be set as this process continues. So as we think about next steps, I would, beg us to think about our colleagues and our peers. How do we set them up for success as we're thinking about what these next steps are? With that, I'll recognize Ms. Andrea to see if I need to be checked or balanced in any kind of way there.
No, I completely agree with you, Mayor Pro Tem. In the spirit of productivity and moving forward, there were some specific things that both council and staff talked about needing to move forward. So before we end, whenever we do, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page as to what those things are.
So thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. And I guess next step to Mayor Pro Tem's point, I didn't bring this up because I hope it could just be a takeaway. But one issue we're facing now, as you look at the new UDO that we implemented July 1, we need to look how we classify landfill construction debris, LCDI. I can tell you, Councilman Graham, Councilman Mayfield, and I have been, let me say it kindly, the citizens are concerned very much about it, and right now, it's in an R3 rezoning, single family, and I believe when you have a landfill, you need to put that in an I1, I2. So to me, that's important, Ms. Craig, as we're talking about moving our city, moving in a different direction. Even some of our rezonings, we need to be careful it's not a negative impact on our communities. The second one is you can put these together, increase safe pedestrian connectivity or eliminate traffic death and senior injuries. And so I can't remember all the different options we have for speed bumps in our neighborhoods, but we're getting more and more requests as a calming tool. I think we used to call them speed bumps, then we call them speed humps, then we call them traffic calming. And so some understanding, council members, what is the process for neighborhoods to get those? And I think we got to get away from how many vehicles go through a community. I think we need to look at this totally different, and it's about safety to those communities who are having issues with speeders. And I tell you, I think our old policy requests if 3,000, some crazy number, 3,000 cars doesn't come through, you do not qualify. We need to look at that policy again and making sure that we're still keeping our neighborhoods safe, but it's not going to be 3,000 vehicles that are going to come through the neighborhood. So, Mayor.
So, Mr. I think you brought up actually a great example, because we have changed it, right? And we looked at it from an equity lens, but we looked at it, we gave staff a pretty clear question. Mm-hmm. How do we change our policy so that it's easier to provide traffic calming? How do we make it easier to build speed humps or speed bumps, right, and put up stop signs? And we were able to do that. And I think if we look back at the policy, I think you'll be happier with the way it's written, but then the challenge still remains, okay, how do we amplify that into the community? And then how do we kind of really put a lot of fuel on that fire to get a bunch of these things done? Because I think we have the policy there. But I think that's, again, a perfect example where we requested an outcome related to infrastructure, and we put staff to work, and they came back, And I think those are we have to find a framework to deal with that, whether it's the places that's directly under our purview or those other 75 places where we have to work with these different other process maps to get those solutions.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem.
awkward silence. So, yeah, huh? So, well, I don't know. Well, I guess at this point in time, I would ask Ms. Babson and Ms. Craig, is that it? Because Ms. Babson has been writing nonstop. I know she's got a lot. I know she's got a lot, but I don't know if she has what she needs to wrap this up and get us to next steps. I don't think we have to decide exactly what the next step is right now, but I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Yes, and you're right. Thank you, council, for this robust discussion. I think we did get a lot of good feedback. And that was what we were hoping for, is to have this kind of a conversation with council, to hear from you and find that right balance between the technical staff perspective and the elected officials' perspective on what's next. This is definitely not the end of this discussion. So you will see us coming back. I think the next steps for us are based on the discussions today. Staff will need some time to process and confer and go back and figure out how to respond to what we heard. In summary, I think what we heard from many of you in the earlier part of the discussion is to really look at, instead of those detailed prioritized areas of infrastructure, to broaden it a bit more and use language that is more common and more understandable, and is probably a bigger umbrella than what those priority areas were. And then, as Councilmember Mayfield mentioned, we'll provide additional information about where those areas are where we have influence, and who those other parties are that influence many of those items on that list. And then, Ms. Johnson, we heard from you that you want more information about zoning decisions, and we can absolutely work on that concurrent with this bigger initiative as well, because I think we can respond to that sooner. And then, as I said, based on this discussion today, we'll go back and we'll make some of those changes and then follow up with you, council, as you have opportunities to hear more from us. We do still think this is probably a 12 to 18-month process, and we want to have routine conversations with you, coming back and presenting information to make sure that we're continuing on the right track.
Ms. Johnson?
So like you said, there could be another council in 12 to 18 months. So how soon do you plan on getting, huh?
There will be.
There will be. Hopefully, some of us will be here. Most of us will be here. But how soon do you plan on coming back to this council with an update? Or what's the next steps for, and I guess council can decide that. When do we want an update?
Well, I'll ultimately let Ms. Babson talk about that, but again, we have meetings coming up, right? We have the Housing and Jobs Summit, where infrastructure certainly connects housing and jobs. We have our council, still have to have our council retreat, infrastructure, and I will be part of that, and Ms. Mayfield and Mr. Driggs are working on those things. And then we'll have our budget process, where we always generally talk about segments of infrastructure, but I'm looking at Mr. Bergman, who is one of the staff members who has helped put this together. And, I'm sure we'll take notes from this meeting and future conversations about how to do that. We also spoke about the need, this was important for us to have a council conversation and a staff conversation, but perhaps council may decide that we need to have another one of these conversations that looks a little different, feels a little different, but includes those necessary partners. I will say that debrief that staff has, I imagine it will include myself, Ms. Bakari, and Ms. Johnson, and Ms. Andrea to help us kind of digest that, to figure out what those next steps are that we can present to the council as a whole. That was my kind of interpretation about how we would handle this. And that's how I feel like we talked about it as a group, as we were coming into that. Is that sufficient?
Yes, that's sufficient. Can I say one last thing?
Absolutely.
I'm sorry. Since
We have plenty of time.
Since we're stating our wish list, right? You asked me something. We talked about a while ago an improved zoning website. We talked about, and I've talked to Mr. Patton about GPS coordinates on the rezonings. So that way, we can analyze ourselves how far this zoning is from the other one, just information, so that and as far as, I know we meet with petitioners, and, there's information to get us. We're not making blind decisions. I'm not saying that. We've been making responsible decisions. However, we don't have the information to take a comprehensive look at the city. Again, from an equitable perspective, when you look at that map, how does that look as far as affordable housing and multifamilies and all of that? We need to be able to make comparative decisions, I think, in order to do this responsibly and to grow in a balanced perspective. There are some areas that we have to preserve our residents' home values. There's just things that we need to consider from a very big picture and 30,000 feet. So we need this information and it looks like we have it. It looks like the city is, the staff is doing a great job in compiling the information. It just, we just need a tool. And the residents need to know that these items are being addressed.
Sure, and so Dave and I will we'll go back and just take another look and see how we might be able to modify the information that we're providing to you to make it easier to understand or more accessible or have some additional layers.
So unless we have any objections, I will adjourn this meeting. The council members and staff, there'll be food downstairs. Yeah, I have an objection, so there, Ms. Mayfield.
When I say it's an objection, it's a question of clarification. If we're going to adjourn this meeting in order to come back together downstairs, do we need to have an official motion to recuse Councilmember Bakari since he has left for family commitment? Or do we
will
just,
have we're going to adjourn this meeting and then start a new meeting at 4, start our
Okay,
rezoning
so
meeting.
do we
it'll
need
be
a
two-
motion to adjourn, a motion and a second to adjourn this, Mr. Baker? Yes. That's what I thought,
Take
so
a
we gotta have a
motion to adjourn this meeting.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
We're adjourned. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much.